to welcome your moderator, Alina Polyakova.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alina Polyakova. I'm a fellow and director at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. And it's really my pleasure to moderate this last interactive panel on election interference. Before I welcome my panel, I think certainly in the United States, we woke up to election interference in 2016. But since then, this has really become a global issue, and an issue that is not just limited to Russian and foreign election interference, as we grapple increasingly with also domestic actors and non-state actors who are trying to interfere in various ways in our democratic processes. To discuss the slew of all these issues, I'm delighted to welcome a panel of the top experts from Europe and the United States on this, as we just come out of some critical elections in this area, including the European elections and, of course, the elections in Ukraine as well. So with that, please welcome my panel to the stage. So before we begin, just a reminder to everyone in the audience to use Slido, which is a new experience for me. So I'll do my best to incorporate all of your questions throughout the session. But let me just go directly to you, Laura. You know, you are working on these issues in the United States. You worked for a very long time inside the US government in various capacities, various roles, including on the Clinton campaign, which was obviously at the peak of, as we learned about Russian election interference in the United States. But increasingly over the last 3 years, we've learned that this is not just confined to the information space. There's a whole slew of operations that kind of fit into this basket of interference. So can you give us kind of the big picture view? What are we really talking about when we're talking about election interference?
Yeah, thanks, Alina. And it's such a privilege to be on stage with all of these wonderful experts on these issues. And thanks to all of you for joining. So I think that that's exactly right. The way I think about election interference is, number one, that election interference is part of a broader ongoing effort by authoritarian regimes in particular to undermine democracies and democratic institutions as a way, frankly, for them to exert geopolitical power. We tend to think about this in terms of discrete elections, but I think it's really important that we bear in mind that in many ways, elections are just one prime opportunity in these ongoing efforts. So for instance, in the United States, what we think of as the interference in the 2016 election, we know in fact started at least as early back as 2014, possibly 2013. So it's really important that we not think about this just as one moment in time, number one. Number two, you're exactly right to highlight that this is not just about information operations or disinformation. This is also a combination of the use of cyber attacks, malign financial influence, corruption, other sorts of funding through licit or other covert means, strategic economic coercion, and subversion of political and social groups. All these things are part of a toolkit that are used to undermine and interfere in democracies.
So thank you, Laura. I want to go back to some of the issues you mentioned as we go through the discussion, this panel. And one thing that you highlighted that doesn't receive enough attention is, of course, the export of corruption and illicit financing, which is becoming such a critical issue across Europe especially, but it's also a critical issue in the United States. So let me come back to that. And I want to bring in, while you think about that, Maricia, who I know is participating in 4 panels at GlobeSec. So really delighted that you're able to join for this one as well. You, of course, have been working on this issue and leading this debate from the European Parliament for a decade now. You've become the leading voice on digital issues from within the EU. And as we have gone through the, the Enlightenment period over the last 3 years, where we've learned about some of the interference toolkits that Laura has described, I think there's a realization that this is not just contained to elections or even specific countries. Mm-hmm. So how can democracies better work together to start to address this issue?
Well, thank you for the introduction, and it's great to be on stage not only with experts but with all women. Let's recognize that it's possible. I wasn't going to mention it. Well, I thought it would be worth a mention because it's too often the other way around. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think you touch on the core issue, which is that we have to recognize that this is about liberal democracy and the agenda of undermining it, where elections are an opportunity, but it's really now also very much, if you look at the EU and the United States, an agenda that is taking hold within our society. So I think it is essential that we are more rigorous at connecting the dots of the entire ecosystem that comes into focus here, whether it's the critical infrastructure of the election process, which in many European countries is not yet defined as such and therefore doesn't enjoy the kinds of protection that critical infrastructures do get or need. But let's also look at the financing, the political advertisement and the transparency, the whole question of what the role of government is, what the role of political parties is, what the role of the private sector is in terms of accountability, in terms of taking their responsibility. And so we've just come out of European elections. I don't think there's been a conclusive analysis of what happened there. So I'm very keen to hear all the research afterwards about, you know, disinformation, but also attempts at hacking or whatnot. But we need to connect the dots and work more closely together. I would really, really hope that we can close the transatlantic rifts when it comes to protecting liberal democracy as well, because right at the moment where we need it most to work together, we're standing with our backs towards each other, and it's quite painful.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think what you highlight is the approach across the Atlantic has been profoundly different. So the U.S. government has responded specifically to this hard question of election security and cybersecurity threats to our critical infrastructure systems. So we have defined our election systems as critical infrastructure, which has been very, very important.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we've been lagging behind, at least in my view, in addressing the information question, addressing the illicit finance question, even though we have done some good things, I think, on the hard security front. But I think what you're pointing to is, I hope the panel, as we progress, we can address this a little bit, is what are some of the best practices and lessons learned that we can start thinking about? We've had all these waves of elections across Europe, in the United States. We had our congressional elections in 2018. We had the presidential elections coming up in 2020. How can we start better learning from each other? So, Lisa, I want to take it over to you to address the issue that Mauricio brought up about the hard defense, the cybersecurity component. How would you assess the response by Europe, and if you want to touch on in the United States, to the protection of our critical infrastructure election systems?
So I have a 2-hour lecture prepared on that exact topic. Thank you. As you rightly pointed just now, in most places, election technology is not critical infrastructure. France has legislated that, the United States has legislated that, but in terms of the sort of like-minded Western nations that are a target, that's about it currently. And it's been reasonably quiet in terms of the technical attacks against both the very center of elections voting and then technology that voting and elections rely on, specifically in the European elections, the European Parliament elections just a couple of weeks ago, as well as the Ukrainian 2 rounds of presidential elections, which is a pity because it could have been such a fun live-fire exercise. We know that in both cases, live-fire exercise that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin does not intend to build us on is the best way to build resilience. Let's face it. What we've seen in the key elections in the last year or so is what any network sees. The testing of whether any doors open, testing of the network perimeter, knocking on windows, possibly trying to breach people. That combined with distributed denial of service attacks, which is an attack that takes availability of public-facing systems down, combined with spear phishing, very cleverly targeted and cleverly engineered attempts to gain access through stealing credentials. But that's really it, which to me means that on the technical side of things, given how opportunistic the adversaries and how much they're constantly evaluating their methods and how there has to be a constant cost-benefit calculation. The adversary seems to not deem the technology underlying our elections their priority target anymore, because we've changed that cost-benefit calculation from the Ukraine saw pretty malicious and well-planned cyber attacks 5 years ago against that presidential election in 2014. The US and France at least saw very persistent and patient attacks leading up to 2016, but that where those technologies were deployed for at least 18 months prior to those elections. We now know that. And we've woken up. The adversary seems to prefer information operations currently, which means that we've reached the baseline level of technical assurance and investment in that, but we mustn't get lazy.
I think the interesting thing you point to that I think a lot of us working on this issue have been thinking about is how the line between cyber, kind of hard cyber issues, and disinformation campaigns is blurring. We saw this very clearly in the United States with the hack and leak and spin, right? We saw this with France.
And personal corruption attempts.
Exactly. So I think as Laura was saying is that all of these methods work in concert with each other as an ecosystem of influence. And how do you deal with both, right? So it's not just about hardening your cyber defenses, which we may have been quite successful at, but it's also about combining a more, I guess, whole of government, whole of society approach to the information space as well. Just some issues I'm picking up as we're talking. So, Katarina, we started talking a little bit more about some specific countries, and you've been focusing a lot on your research, your GlobeSec, on Central Eastern Europe, of course. And talking about the information space, perhaps a bit more specifically, are there some specific examples that you would point to from your research that either highlight best responses or weaknesses in the information domain?
We've been monitoring various elections in the past 6 months, predominantly the Slovak presidential elections in March, April in Slovakia, and then EP elections in the Visegrad 4 countries. We don't have conclusive data at the moment. We're still digging it through, but first thing we observed is that we monitored these activities on Facebook. We monitored Facebook disinformation pages that we known from our previous research that have a tendency to spread disinformations or get to involve in information framing. And we found out that their activity varies depending on the elections. Slovakia, EP elections are not very popular. In the previous ones we had 13% attendance. This year it was 23% attendance, and their activity was super small. So they really know which elections to focus on, which elections are important for a particular country, because we saw a huge activity of these Facebook pages focusing on the presidential election in Slovakia, and there was a huge intensive smear campaign led against our president-elect, Ms. Čaputová. I mean, they had their own candidate there. They were massively supporting, and they were basically dissing predominantly her when she got into the second round of election. When it comes to EP elections, we saw a different approach when it comes to countries. There was a very little activity in the Czech Republic, but there was a huge activity in Hungary. We attribute this activity to the fact that our partners usually say that you never know where does the Orban's propaganda end and where does the Russian propaganda starts, and the capture of government. Capture of media, Hungarian media, by the government is very intense in Hungary. So we saw extensive activity in Hungary, and we saw promotion of Fidesz predominantly on this online platform. But we observed similar narratives. I mean, the most dominant misleading and disinformative narrative that was spread in all countries was that migration is a threat. And when you take into consideration that these countries are really not the recipients of migrants, nobody wants to stay in Slovakia, or very little people go to Poland, everybody wants to go to the Western Europe. These things are completely not based on facts.
I think what's interesting about the work you're doing here in the region with GlobeSec, Katarina and your colleagues, is that it shows how over the last few years we have ramped up our efforts to try to identify and expose disinformation narratives, actors. Obviously, social media companies have been taking down a lot of pages, accounts that they call as participating in inauthentic coordinated behavior. We see these press releases quite often now, which I would like to get a sense of whether you think they've done enough, actually. So I want to stick with this information question for a little bit. And I think some of the points you make about how tailored some of these campaigns are is very critical, because it raises the question of, can you have one size fits all policy from the social media companies as well? Because I do think what's different here, perhaps as opposed in some cases to hard network security, is that this is not just about governments, shoring up their own defenses. There's a third layer here, which of course is the private sector, right? And I wish always.
So on technical security.
That's right.
It's not. No one just protects their own networks anymore.
Right. Yeah, so I do want to get into this information question a little bit more. And I guess the question I'll pose to all of you to get us started is, let me start with you, since you've been working directly on this policy from inside the European Union and have worked closely with the Commission, I understand, as well. What is the responsibility of the tech companies, and have they done enough with some of these efforts that we're talking about so far?
So for years, we heard that we should not watch too many movies when we expressed our concern about their knowing or unknowing, willing or unwilling influence on democratic processes. And I'm talking about the big platform social media companies, search engines right now. And then suddenly, because the pressure on their reputation and the spotlight on their role has increased, indeed, as you said, every week or every couple of days, we can read new press releases about the amount of accounts taken down, which now number into billions, yes, according to some accounts. So how can we possibly trust the PR efforts by these companies after they first basically denied having any impact? Now they're taking down billions of accounts. And if you look at their economic success and the sophistication with which they could look at data harvesting, micro-targeting, matching ads with users, I'm not at all convinced that they cannot do much more to weed out some of the blatant abuses. And I believe that it is now high time to stop believing all the nice PR and answers that they're giving to questions, and we must acknowledge that there's a lot we don't know. Just because 5 measures are taken, or X amount of accounts are taken down, or research is being released on certain activities, doesn't mean we know everything. And I believe we need to know much more about the longer-term impact of the influencing of algorithms on our information ecosystem, just on the public debate in general. Not to suggest that this is all malign interference, but information is always a core component of control or of freedom and also of democracy. So I would like to know much more about the impact of algorithms. I think we need transparency on it. And I think there has to be independent oversight as well as independent research in the public interest. So self-regulation, the window has closed. Yeah. The trust has been completely lost in terms of what these companies are telling us. And so it is time to step it up in the public and democratic interest.
Well, I think certainly with the regulatory moves have been much more prominent from the European Union than they've been from the United States. And we basically find ourselves where in a situation now we've basically done nothing to try to solve this question with our American companies that are of course operating in all these other countries, and now we're in this bizarre situation where it's the European Union and other European member states that are regulating or trying to regulate American firms. And so how do we really try to bridge that gap? And I do think some of the efforts they've initiated have should be commended. It's better than when we were 3 years ago. But every day there's a news story. Just I think last week there was a story about YouTube's algorithm.
Yep.
Automatically, I don't know if all of you saw that. It was a New York Times story how the YouTube algorithm has been pulling together snippets of people's family videos with children, and then basically making them accessible to people looking for child pornography. This is really abhorrent and awful. And so I think some of the issues you raise about transparency get us into really tricky category when it comes to intellectual property rights that these companies use as a defense against that. And of course now in the United States, Laura, I want to turn to you a little bit about this. This has become a big political issue where we have already in campaign season, unfortunately, in the U.S., way ahead, and a lot of the Democratic candidates are talking about antitrust legislation when it comes to these companies. They're too big, we're going to break them up. One of the founders of Facebook wrote an article, an op-ed suggesting this is the answer. Yet we're really lagging behind, I think, Europe. We're thinking about smart regulatory approaches. Laura, what do you think about this responsibility question and where this is all heading, where that third sphere is heading?
Yeah, so I'm going to take a step back and put on my national security hat, which is where I've spent much of my career. And when I look at these issues and I think about the way the kinds of things that we're talking about and the broader implications of them, we're talking about how the information architecture of the next several decades is going to be defined. And there are basically a few actors that are engaging in the process of defining that architecture. There's American tech companies. There are Chinese tech companies, Chinese party state connected tech companies. And then there is the EU, which is putting in place some these regulatory frameworks that we've talked about. And so to me, the implications are not just how do we deal with the kind of tactical pieces that are incredibly important, but how do we take the step back and think about how we define these technologies, these information defining technologies for the 21st century in a way that supports democracy, open debate, truth, and in a way that resists the authoritarian tendency toward control and manipulation of information, which we know certainly the Chinese Communist Party is making great strides in building tech platforms that meet its needs and frankly beginning to export those technologies to other countries, including, by the way, in this region. Absolutely. So that's the backdrop for how I think about this question, which means, A, I think it's really important, but B, I think that we really need to not just regulate for this moment, but understand both how are the regulations we're putting in place going to help define democracy-affirming kinds of information spaces and reduce the space for authoritarian forces. What that means for me, to take it practical for 1 second, is number one, we need entirely new models for engagement between the public and private sector. Right now, we have a pretty unconstructive engagement between those sectors, certainly in the US. The political overtones that you mentioned are making this even more challenging. I think right now we sort of hear two different things from particularly members of Congress. And one is that the tech companies aren't doing enough to deal with these problems, and the other is that the tech companies are doing too much to deal with these problems, or it's the wrong problems that they're going after, or they're biased, or this or that. And so I think we really need to, number one, have a clear strategy from the government side, but number two, understand that it's going to have to be cooperation between the public and private sector, between the government and the tech companies, and frankly, a really substantial role for civil society in terms of building resilience that is going to require getting over this political overtone.
The whole of society approach.
Yeah.
So Lisa, I want to get your response to what Laura, Maricia, and Katrina have put on the table. And maybe as part of your response, you may want to consider an answer to one of the audience questions that's asking about last year's Irish referendum and how both Facebook and Google banned foreign-funded political advertising online, and whether that was, in your opinion, you don't have to talk about it, somebody else can touch base on it, whether that was an effective or useful way to try to curb interference in key political events. But let me get you to respond to what Laura and Maricia have said about the social media space.
So, in both the cyber and the social media or disinfo part of this equation, I think in how we've had conversations, we've self-sabotaged by talking about technology and framing this as a technical question, which it's not. I mean, when it comes to voting, having a political debate is about the content of the debate and how we frame that debate, rather than whether that debate happens online, face-to-face, standing on a soapbox. This needs to be a conversation about democratic rights and, in particular, freedom of speech. Americans have framed the social media part of it as a restriction of freedom of speech, which is, what do we call it in the business, is simply a big fat lie. Mm-hmm. The fundamental right of the citizens that we have to focus here is that of transparency, knowing who's whispering into your ear. As societies, we all understand that political discourse can get heated, that political discourse can have ideological representations of issues that we might not necessarily agree with. That's fine, but what this is really about is amplification of voices in a non-transparent way that are whispering different messages into the ears of our citizens. And what this is about is synthetically creating voices in societies that don't organically exist, but that sow doubt and confusion, create sharp cleavages. And which is why your GlobeSex research is so very important on this. Which brings us to the question of, are we doing enough? What we're doing is necessary, what the platforms are doing is necessary, but not sufficient. It's this fear of being regulated, motivated, reactive, dealing with symptoms. We're taking down accounts that are clearly synthetic and fake. Did you see the notification Facebook put on the clearly augmented Nancy Pelosi video, which was augmented for her to look like she might not be quite in control of her abilities to voice an opinion?
I'm assuming everybody is familiar with this video at this point, so...
It's a video that was augmented to make her look like she's having trouble forming full sentences.
And it was not a deep fake.
It was slowed down, basically.
Which, not being able to form full sentences is something that's completely unheard of in American politics currently, of course. And all that Facebook did, after it was so clearly established that this has been changed, this has been slowed down, was to put a little warning on it saying, this has been fact-checked and doesn't check out. Right. As opposed to saying fake, fake, fake all over it, which is what talking about it, our human reaction is. So it's clear that the platforms, especially the bigger platforms that have a lot at stake and that are protecting their market share, are doing the minimum of what doesn't have us throwing rotten tomatoes at them, and that's not enough.
And I think what's interesting is that something that this video, the Pelosi of augmented video revealed, is how there's no consistency in the response across the platforms at all. They all respond in various different ways. Facebook in one way, YouTube another way, Google another way, Twitter so definitely in a different way. So I think this is also the big question, should these companies kind of be forced to come up with a common terms of use or a common policy? I know you're shaking your head no. As we're talking about this issue, I want to bring in the audience either through Slido, but also if you have a question and you want to catch my eye, please do. Happy to take questions as we go along. But there's somebody behind me, I see. Sir, give me 1 second. Katarina, before I go to the audience, let me get you to respond to some of this, because I think one point that Lisa brought up that I think is really a challenge and it's very fascinating is the domestic, foreign, organic, non-organic evolution of disinformation operations. I think this is something that you've certainly, I think, been tracking in your research, right? That as we have responded, they have adapted, and now we are in a situation where we have mostly domestic voices, so organic voices, they're just being amplified by actors playing on the margins. But how do we deal with that question, right? So I don't necessarily have to answer that difficult question, but what are your thoughts on that? And then I will take 2 questions from the audience as you think about that.
Yeah.
Okay. So Sir, and then Anya.
Jonathan Isle from the Royal United Services Institute in London, and congratulations, Madam Chair, on your own pioneering work on extreme right-wing organizations.
Thank you for plugging that. I appreciate it.
No, because it was a building block to a lot of the discussions that are taking place now. It's a very practical question. Usually, our American colleague will know very well, intelligence services get a feel for this as an election campaign starts. Usually we have a lot of information about what is going on. The question is there any thinking about how much of it can be released as the election campaign goes on in order to have a direct actionable effect on these operations? I refer to Israel, for instance, where the Electoral Commission in the latest parliamentary elections there acted during the election campaign in shutting down some of these bots. Some of them actually operated by political parties, one against the other, as part of dirty tricks campaigns. So how much of it, this is the story of 2016 American elections, how much of the intelligence information which the president had should have been released in order to have a direct impact? I know it's not easy, but I think it's a critical question.
It is a key question. What is the role of the intelligence community in all of this? And Anya, let me pull you into this as well, please.
Agnia Grigas, Atlantic Council. To what extent do you think the conversation we're having is about an inherent vulnerability of democratic societies and in the digital age? And do you think more closed societies or authoritarian societies are somewhat immune to this type of influence? Thank you.
It's a fantastic question that Laura had also put on the table at the very onset. So the role of intelligence agencies, are authoritarian regimes actually more resilient, ironically enough? Katerina, let me wrap up a little bit of this information conversation, unless Mauricia, I saw your hand and a shake of the head, so I think you want to come in as well.
On. It's okay, I can jump back in later.
Okay, but Katerina, let me get you to respond to what we've been talking about, especially on how to deal with this evolving information threat.
I think first and foremost, we as states, as politicians, need to define that information operations present a threat to our national security. And this is not something that is common for all EU countries. I mean, we're in a country where the Slovak security strategy, the official one, dates back to 2005. I think it's significantly outdated and doesn't really take into consideration the information operation or information framing and bots, trolls, and everything that we've seen in the past years now. So we need a political will that is willing to point out that this is happening and we need to build our resilience. And we need to start taking measures and we need to build a hold of society, hold of government approaches, because it's not about only shutting down the Facebook accounts that are spreading malign information or hoaxes, but it's about building resilience within people, critical thinking, digital media knowledge. So and that takes time. You cannot really build critical thinking very much among people who believe in conspiracy theories. Last year we did polling and we polled conspiracy questions, and 53% of Slovaks came up, they decided and they thought that there are secret society groups aiming to establish a totalitarian world order. And 40% of Slovaks thought that the terrorist attack on 9/11 was a U.S. inside job.
40%.
Yeah. So, it's not something that you can switch just from one day to another. It's a result of lack of critical thinking. It's a result of bad education policies, and we need to work on that. But, for that, you need a political will that is going to explicitly state that information operations present a threat to our democracy. Something that we observed during the monitoring is that lots of one of the most popular disinformation narrative that was being spread in connection to especially the Slovak presidential election was that that the elections are being rigged, that the media is not presenting correct information when it comes to polling, that even like a computer company that provides security software that is being used by election committee, can rig the system and change the outcomes, and nobody would know about it because they want to and are supporting particular candidate. So when people think that voting or going to vote doesn't really matter, that's problematic, because that's how we choose our leaders. That's how we decide the geopolitical orientation and development of our countries. And this is something that we've seen in Slovakia and other countries as well.
And this also goes back to, I think, what you were saying earlier, Lisa, that the reason why there's a preference for information operations, perhaps one, they're cheap, and all you need is to plant the idea. You don't need to break into data systems, right? You don't need to go through all that process. And you can accomplish everything you need to get accomplished by these kinds of methods. I think this goes to Agnieszka's questions about resistance and resilience, right? And who and what kinds of institutions are actually more resilient, perhaps, in the long term to these kinds of operations. I will take this moment to shamelessly plug a paper because I see Ambassador Daniel Fried to my left. We have a paper coming out next week on June 13th that talks about these specific issues called Democratic Defense Against Disinformation. The Atlantic Council is publishing it. It's the second edition that takes stock, so a report card on what we've done so far in the information space. So that look out for that. But shameless plug over. So I do want to talk about this resistance resilience question. Now, Laura, you wanted to come in, perhaps in direct response to what's been put on the table.
Yeah, so quickly on that piece, I could have an extended conversation on this. It's an important question, but I would just note that the tactics in particular that the Internet Research Agency has been using externally, as well as the tactics that the Chinese Communist Party is using to shape and manipulate the information space, these are tactics that were actually first developed, trained, and used on the Russian population and on the Chinese population. So I don't think
the domestic populations.
The domestic populations, right? So I don't think it's necessarily a question to them being more resilient. I think, in fact, that in many ways the manipulation just takes a very different form, and it looks different because it's happening internally by their own governments. But I don't necessarily think that it's a real resilience in the true meaning of the word. I do want to take on this important question about the intelligence community and what information should be shared, because I think it's a really critical question. And I, again, could have an extended conversation about this because I've done a lot of work on it. But in brief, I would say a few things. One, I think if we look at lessons learned from a number of different countries in terms of what are best practices in response, exposure and public awareness are really critical to building resilience. And so things like, for instance, the annual Estonian intelligence report that really catalogs all kinds of threats to that country, right, including on these issues. Sweden does something similar. There's some really good models out there in terms of how to be more transparent and share information on threats. I think there's a lot of indications that doing that in real time from authoritative sources can also be really important in terms of raising public awareness. I think there's a couple of challenges, though. One is you want to expose and raise awareness in a way that doesn't amplify the activity. So you have to be careful about what specifically you are calling out and giving megaphone to. Two is, I think it needs to come from authoritative voices, right? And so I do think in many countries, intelligence services are positioned to do that, but not all of them. So I think that's another key point. Third is, I think we have to take the politics out of this decision making. It's certainly one of the challenges we faced in the US in 2016 was that there was a lot of calculation about how making this information public may sway the election one way or the other. That national security can never come down to that. And so we need to put in place mechanisms, mandatory reporting requirements, other kinds of things that require transparency and raising awareness publicly about these issues. But the last thing I would say is I think that there is also a space between publicly putting out this information and other sorts of information sharing, which is what I was kind of getting at between the public and private sector. Both, the public sector, law enforcement, and the intelligence community has information on certain kinds of threat activities, particularly foreign actors. What they don't have, and frankly I don't think they should have, is insights into what's happening domestically on platforms about political speech. I don't believe that we want our intelligence services tracking who's saying what about politics in our political campaigns. But the platforms do know that. And so if we can put in place robust mechanisms with protections for privacy, with protections for speech, for the intelligence community and the law enforcement agencies to share information with the social media platforms, to put the puzzle pieces together, that's how we begin to go after this systematically, after key nodes, and bring down networks in a much bigger way, rather than the kind of piecemeal stuff that Alina noted, we see each week right now in these takedowns. I mean, we need a much more systematic approach, and I think that's going to be the way we get there.
I think, Lisa, you wanted to touch specifically on the intelligence question. Then, Richard, I want to take it over to you to respond. Sure. And then audience members think of additional questions. I will go to you right after that. Okay, please.
So in addition to what Laura said, and as an Estonian, I'm all for aggressive transparency, which fully appreciating that that might not be the natural modus operandi for the intelligence communities anywhere in the world. But what we've gotten pretty good at is sort of our own asset-based risk management, understanding what networks, what debates in public, which organizations are prime targets, and then trying to protect them. Where we have so much room for improvement, and where the intelligence community is uniquely positioned in most Western communities, is adversarial behavior modeling. Trying to understand what it is that the adversary is doing. There's a few things we know already that are clear. The adversary is reactive and opportunistic. We know that. The adversary doesn't seem to be really wishing to advance any particular policy view or candidate, but rather sow confusion and doubt. The formidable Herb Lynn calls it chaos production.
Right.
And that's
that
what
term.
there is.
Yes.
But then there's more technical pieces where the intelligence community, unlike the sort of public, civilian, cybersecurity agencies, and then the management bodies, they don't preach as well as the intelligence community, is what do we see on the ground and what does that tell us? The attacks we've seen are quite formulaic, both in the information space, but also, me, you, and a bottle of wine could at this point model a GRU attack. It starts with spear phishing, very well designed spear phishing that's well targeted. That's where the bottle of wine comes in. Then once credentials are stolen, malware that's generally used by APT28 and APT29, the two hacking groups that are believed to be GRU and the Civilian Foreign Intelligence, the FSB, they carry on to install X agent and X tunnel. One of them is malware, the other one calls back home. And then from that stage, they're putting a lot of effort into flying below the radar to be undetected. The 18 months of sitting in the Democrats' networks before anyone thought to ask the questions. So we know those pieces, and how to put that into a behavioral model is where I do hope the intelligence communities step up.
And do you think that intelligence agencies should be releasing some of this information they might be tracking to the public at various moments?
Oh, absolutely. A, there's the value of educating the public, and B, it actually serves the long-term interest of the intelligence community, since they're so incredibly over-mystified. And, the public, of course, is shocked and disturbed that the intelligence community spies. But so let's be transparent about it. Yes, this is our role in fulfilling the national interest. And, every government puts resources into that. And the moment you actually step up and say that, you can't be played anymore in the public sphere. You can't be over-mystified. Words can't be put into your mouth if you say them first yourself.
Yeah, I do think Laura's point is really important about this. Will vary significantly by country, and also where people trust the intelligence agencies versus not. Of course, I don't want to have a deep conversation about the declining level of trust in our societies, in our government institutions, our mainstream media, etc. But this is something that I think has to be considered. So I saw your various points shaking your head, sometimes agreeing. Let me pull you in, and then I'll I'll take a couple more questions from the audience.
So I think we've been behind in terms of developing a governance model on how to deal with this within democracies. So there's been a real hands-off approach to dealing with technologies in general. And I think that is also explaining why there's so much confusion in the debate right now. Because if we think that this is about fake news, for example, then we could lose years, as we probably have, assessing what is true and what is not true, instead of understanding what the actual aims are, which is eroding the trust in liberal democracy as such. And in that sense, we could assess that our adversaries are extremely successful because, as you say, there's a lot of authorities, whether it's the media, whether it's professors and universities, whether it is government, whether it's police and law enforcement, that are easily dismissed as being untrustworthy or as being the instruments to silence the voices of the people, right? This is what we hear a lot from our populist parties, is that their opinions are not allowed to be heard, and that is why the powers that be are turning against them. And this is now actually an accusation that the social media platforms are confronted with. They are accused of being left-wing or right-wing by others or whatnot. So I think it may well be that sooner rather than later, the companies, as we've heard some initial sound bites, are going to actually really want regulation, because then they don't have to ad hoc with each and every takedown, each and every decision have to defend what they're doing, but they can refer to the law. And I certainly think that before we can conclude, this is in response to the question, whether democracies are inherently vulnerable or whether they have somehow failed, we can only answer that question when we've tried. And I think one of the real problems is that we have not tried to make sure that the rule of law applies online. In fact, we've done the opposite. We've for a long time trusted that the strength of the innovations could make democracy go viral, that the strength of sort of liberty going global would convince people automatically. We failed to understand or recognize in actions that the agency of authoritarian regimes, but also the agency of tech companies, has also been amplified so significantly by technologies that it's not just individuals and democracies that are empowered. So what I believe we need to do is to really take all the measures that are necessary in the public interest as transparent and non-political as possible to make sure that we rebuild that trust and that we don't have ad hoc reactionary responses to every decision that's made, because we cannot afford to waste so much time on relatively small elements that will drag us into the question of is this fake or is this real, instead of building the full resilience of liberal democracies.
This is an excellent point.
Amen. Amen.
Absolutely. I think some of our audience members on Slide are asking some of those similar questions, because it's how do we deal kind of with the class of problems instead of focusing, on one ad here, on one piece of one meme there, one YouTube video here. It's really about the whole ecosystem and kind of trying to understand how do we deal with the problem before it arises, right? And I love the idea of thinking about democracy going viral and not taking that as something that will, poof, happen like magic, right?
But we also have to make sure, but that our measures are respecting democracy. Because
Absolutely.
one of the real risks is that if measures are not taken properly, that they could be accused of eroding democracy, or in fact unintendedly actually eroding democracy if they don't respect free speech or other kinds of principles. And this is where I understand the hesitation to interfere, because everything related to speech is hypersensitive. And the accusation of regulating speech is easily made. Accusation of regulating the internet, to the extent that that's even possible, has distracted, because we should regulate for openness, for democracy, for the rule of law.
That's right. And I think we can have a whole separate panel about how what we do in democratic societies sets a precedent for some authoritarian societies as well.
Yeah.
Potentially. I mean, there's a couple examples of this. We brought up this question that's at the top of Slido right now about the organic disinformation versus non-organic. I don't know if we can really get into that, but I'll let you all think about this, and let me see if there's anybody else in the audience that wants to ask a question. Ambassador Fried.
I like the suggestions about rules to frame up regulation, which I think is coming. I think certainly the U.S. Congress is prepared to regulate, and it being the U.S. Congress, they're going to go with enthusiasm, and they need to be, I think that civil society groups like this have some input. So my question is, what are the underlying principles that should guide regulation? and I like the notion that the regulation should be consistent with the democratic rules of the game. Okay, we don't have to become them to fight them. Old rule of the Cold War. But then what? And I want to drill down on this because I also think the European Union is approaching regulation. That's the logic of the processes that the EU has started, which I think are well ahead of ours and could be a model.
So we have time for maybe one more question from the audience, if anybody wants to chime in here. All right, so with about 5 minutes to go, this is lightning round, and this is certainly not a lightning round question, I will say that. So about the regulation environment, what should be the principles guiding it? I think, Mircea, you started talking about this, but I want to just go around the panel, get all of you to respond to any element of this, and Mircea, maybe I'll wrap up with you to talk about the regulatory question at the end, if that works.
Perfect.
So, Katarina, let me start with you.
I think that the first principle, if we want to come up with some regulations that are going to work and they're going to be effective, we need to include all the actors involved. So it cannot be something that is going to be dumped on the social media platforms, but they have to be actively behind that table and on the other side, and like debate all the things. So it needs to be inclusive in the sense that whether it's non-governmental organization, whether it's state actors, whether it's social media platforms, they're going to be behind that table and going to have their say and insight of what's working and what's not working.
Laura?
Well, if we're to start with an American perspective, I mean, the fact that the U.S. doesn't have any kind of regulatory, or I would say, frankly, rights-based framework around data, to me is a massive gaping hole. We have no framework around data protection, data privacy, or data security, which means that not only is there no control given to citizens of what happens with their data, but it also means that there's no accountability for companies that see breach after breach after breach. I think many of us have probably started to just ignore the many notices we get of our information being hacked once again, right? So that's kind of a baseline that I think we need to put in place. I think, frankly, if we look at authoritarian regimes, certainly the Chinese party state has understood how data is an incredibly powerful thing, and we in the United States have not yet grappled with that. Very much to Dan's point, I'm not advocating that we adopt the Chinese approach to vacuuming data and handing it over to government authorities, but I think that, number one, we haven't recognized, in fact, that what I would argue is actually a conflict that is taking place with our data being the bullets in a way. But we need to put that kind of framework in place. I also think there are a certain number of transparency requirements that could be put in place from a regulatory perspective that, again, I think it gets to a lot of what Mircea was talking about. But if we force transparency, that will also bring accountability in different ways. And that's also very consistent with democratic principles. And then I think the third thing is that, I'm really kind of I got a big focus on this information sharing piece, but I'm gonna foot stomp it again. I think putting in place some legal frameworks, which, by the way, we've done on other issues, right? That, like, we have frameworks around information sharing on counterterrorism. We have frameworks on information sharing on cybersecurity. We have frameworks on information on financial integrity. Yep. Congress has acted to put all those things in place previously. Those are also the kinds of things that, again, it's not exactly regulatory per se, but it's a space where there can again be created this muscle memory and these pathways for sharing in a way that actually will help fortify us.
Lisa, let me get you to chime in here. We have about 2 minutes left because Mircea has to actually run to a panel right after this. So let me get you to weigh in, and Mircea, I will give you the final word.
So for me in policy, it's important that we don't tie our policy down to particular technologies, but rather focus on the rights. Since policy will always be slower than technology in development, the moment we write any particular technologies or technical approaches into regulation, we're already doomed. And that's the only way we can be agile and as flexible as the threat actors, be it domestic or international, in actually managing those risks. And in that rights-based type of thing, I have three things that we absolutely need to do.
Very briefly.
Very briefly, 1, 2, 3. One, and I apologize for the cliche, but critical thinking is the only way we can actually have open public discussion. Secondly, and this is a particular weakness in the United States, Europe is so far ahead, is work with the most likely attack surface, which is the parties and candidates, and it still is. 4 out of the 62,000, as I understand them, Democratic campaigns for president in 2020 have implemented DMARC, which is a free, very basic email protection system that's available freely, and there's a video on how to do it. And thirdly, and this is where the United States is so far ahead of Europe that we're not even seeing the United States, they're several laps ahead of us, is the operational information exchange. During elections, during the active phase of elections, having a platform where we can, I'm seeing this, I'm seeing that as well. And we as Europe need to be better at learning from each other's mistakes, because we're really good at repeating the same mistake 27 and a half times over.
Mm-hmm. Richard, you have 1 minute to
Yes.
solve the problem for us.
I'll do my best. I honestly believe that the democratic world has to come together and make sure the rule of law applies online. So to the extent possible, make sure that existing laws translate into the online sphere. We haven't even done that to a large extent. So that means putting the public interest first, not outsourcing to private sector companies, because that in and of itself pulls it out of independent oversight and creates profit incentives at odds with democratic incentives. For some areas, I think there might be a need for new laws, like artificial intelligence, facial recognition, algorithmic decision-making, perhaps bots, but we could probably build on what we know already. I foresee that intermediary liability exemption, so the lack of responsibility and liability for platforms, is going to be gone in the US and in the EU within the next 5 to 10 years. So that will also change the liability of those private actors that play such a strong role in the information ecosystem. And then the way to do it, to be more agile, to be faster, is to put the principles of the rule of law first. So I would say freedom of expression first, applying that online too. Probably not to bots. I don't know why a bot should enjoy the same free speech as human beings do. Non-discrimination, and combining those two. I mean, if you collect all kinds of data, would it be allowed offline to target very, very specific groups of people on the basis of their sexual orientation, political preferences, perhaps search results that say things about their medical conditions? I mean, there are so many dots we can connect, fair competition being an important one, questions of micro-targeting. And then if we have these framework principles of the rule of law clear, then I believe it should be about empowering regulators to apply oversight and to attach consequences. Because don't be mistaken, a lot of very, very unjust and possibly illegal things happen every day with data breaches and interference from malignant actors. And there is so little accountability. And that in and of itself erodes the trust in our ability in democracies to meet these challenges. And so as such, we're handing it to our adversaries.
Absolutely.
And I think that that cycle has to be broken.
So you wrapped us up in a beautiful way. Thank you for that. Everybody, please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.